Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special investing report brought to you in association with Bank of New Zealand. Today's investing report is special because I'm standing up in front of a whiteboard and a bunch of blobs and boxes and lines on the board there, and I'm also talking about Alan Hubbard's financial affairs because now we have 3 reports from the statutory manager into his various interests, including Aorangi Securities, Hubbard Management Funds, Southbury Group and South Canterbury Finance. And we're starting to piece together now this complex and intermingled series of affairs which the statutory managers talked about in their first report. My contention here, which is backed up by the comments made in the statutory manager's report and from what we know from South Canterbury, is that Alan Hubbard has for years been passing money around between groups, that he has essentially been running a great big money go round. Let's start off with a couple of years ago when South Canterbury Finance announced with great fanfare that its founder, its main shareholder Alan Hubbard, had put a significant amount of fresh equity into South Canterbury Finance. It turned out South Canterbury Finance had used its cash to buy shares in a 1/3 stake in Dairy Holdings, which was then owned by Alan Hubbard. He had used that money to buy more shares back into South Canterbury. So no new cash actually came into South Canterbury. Then earlier this year, in March, Alan Hubbard injected, in theory, more assets into South Canterbury Finance in the form of Scales Corporation and Helicopters New Zealand. It turned out, of course, these were assets, again, not cash, and in many cases they had loans to South Canterbury Finance and to Face Finance. It's now where we start to dig more deeply into the head companies, if you like, at the top of this tree and start to understand the money go around that was going between these companies down to South Canterbury, up to Southbury, across to Aorangi, across to Hubbard Management Funds and all around the place, and start to unravel this complex intermingling of affairs. Righto, let's start off with Aorangi Securities. Now, this was a company that didn't have a prospectus, where we had several hundred investors, often from around the Timaru region, who had put money into Aorangi Securities. They thought they had put their money with Alan Hubbard and he had invested it in shares in other assets, and that sometimes the money had been invested in first-ranking loans against farmland. It turned out this wasn't really the case, and the statutory managers have found some of the money is missing. Some of the money was not put against first-ranking securities, particularly land. In fact, much of it was lent or invested in very high risk, often very illiquid, and very difficult to sell assets. It turns out now that investors in Aorangi and Hubbard Management Funds are now likely to get only 23 cents in the dollar by the middle of next year. But let's have a look at the structure of what was going on and how much money was flowing around the place. First up, Aorangi Securities. $132 million was in there, apparently, according to the first statutory manager's report. Investors had $96 million invested in there. The second statutory manager's report found there was $5.6 million in cash that was supposed to be in Aorangi, that was controlled by investors, but wasn't actually there. So there's the first pot of missing money. Secondly, we now find out that Aorangi Securities owes money, essentially, to a bunch of private equity investments, $8 million, that needs to be paid out. So that's more in the case of a debt than an equity. We also find out there are a whole bunch of charitable trusts underneath Aorangi Securities, including the Tatua Trust, we should all remember that one, the Barnes Charitable Trust, the Temple Bar Family Trust, the Hubbard Church Trust Management Limited, Forrester Nominees, and also a bunch of others. Now, what we find out from the reports is that Alan Hubbard, personally in many cases, was investing money through Aorangi and the Tatua Trust into a bunch of farms which he controlled. Turns out now that many of those farmers believed that the money being invested was Alan Hubbard's, not anybody else's, although Alan Hubbard seemed to believe it was his money to invest, many of them from charitable trusts, which, as we understand, have not been registered as charitable trusts. We then find that a significant amount of money was invested by Aorangi Securities into Southbury Holdings, which is Alan Hubbard's personal vehicle. a significant amount of money from Hubbard Management Funds was put into Southbury Holdings, which was then put into South Canterbury Finance. So we're starting to see a pattern here of a money go round, money being shuffled from one vehicle to another to keep ahead of the cash flow. We then move through to the third statutory manager's report, and we're starting to see some quite disturbing features in Alan Hubbard's financial management. We've discovered, for example, that one of the tenants in the properties owned by Aorangi Securities entered to a trust. No rent was actually being paid, and rent only started being paid when a statutory manager was reported. We found out that many of the loans made by Aorangi to the farmers involved weren't actually performing. In fact, only 17 of the 51 loans weren't performing. It turns out that many of those farmers believed that they had been invested by Alan Hubbard, not by the others. In fact, some of them believed that their loans had been forgiven and that money didn't need to be repaid. It turns out, according to the statutory manager, that many of those loans weren't documented, and that when loans were forgiven, they were forgiven on a handshake, and there are no record of those. So we have potential legal action and disputes between the statutory manager and various farmers involved. Then we go to Hubbard Management Funds, and this is right at the top of the tree, if you like, the big pyramid. And it turns out Hubbard Management Funds had invested money in South Canterbury Finance, also in Southbury Holdings. There was a relationship between Aorangi and Hubbard Management Funds. Hubbard Management Funds, it turns out, had invested a lot of money in Australian mining stocks, in various private equity ventures, and also in various loans as well. This is the problem here in the Alan Hubbard financial empire. We have significant amounts of cash, which is missing between Aorangi. There's also significant questions about 7 million or so between Hubbard Management Funds and Aorangi. I'll put a lot of the detail in the article underneath this video, but I just wanted to show you how complex, how intermingled, how many related party dealings there were between Southbury Holdings, owned by Alan Hubbard and his wife, Aorangi Securities, where people had invested money, Hubbard Management Funds, and also South Canterbury Finance. Much of the money was cycling between all three of these. Money that some people thought was actually first-ranking loans turned out with second or third-ranking behind banks. Much of it now has gone. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was a special investing report brought to you in association with Bank of New Zealand about Alan Hubbard and his great big money go round.